The silence of the Arizona Territory wasn't peaceful. It was a predator. It crouched in the long shadows of the saguaros and listened with 1,000 unseen ears. For Aara Hayes, a widow of 3 months, that silence was a constant reminder of the single gunshot that had stolen her husband Jedediah and left her utterly alone. Now it was broken only by the frantic pounding of her own heart. A wounded man lay bleeding on her cabin floor, his skin the color of fired clay, his hair as black as a raven's wing. He was Apache, an enemy, a raider, and she, with her husband's rifle still warm in her hands, had just made a choice that would burn her world to ash. The year is 1873. The dust of the San Carlos Reservation dispute had not settled. It had been kicked into the air, choking the life out of any semblance of peace between the settlers and the Apache. For Aara Hayes, politics were a distant hum, like flies buzzing over a corpse. Her world had shrunk to the 4 log walls of the cabin Jedediah had built with his own hands, and the small, cross-marked patch of earth behind it where he now lay. Life had become a litany of chores, a rhythm of survival. Chop the wood, haul the water, tend the meager garden, clean the rifle. Each task was a prayer, a penance, a way to keep from thinking. The loneliness was a physical entity, a cold presence that sat beside her at the rough-hewn table and lay beside her in the empty bed. Jedediah had been a good man, a strong man, full of laughter and dreams of a ranch that would stretch to the distant Dragoon Mountains. A stray bullet from a skirmish, she never saw a fight between prospectors and unseen raiders miles away, had turned all those dreams to dust. She was 26, but her reflection in the water bucket showed a woman aged by grief. Her corn silk hair was often tied back in a severe practical knot, and her blue eyes, once the color of a summer sky, were now muted, clouded by vigilance. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the mesquite brush sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her veins. She was a lone woman in a land that devoured the weak. On this particular afternoon, the air grew heavy, charged with an Uin energy. The birds fell silent. Even the incessant buzz of the cicadas seemed to hold its breath. From the north, a faint popping sound drifted on the wind. Gunfire. It was distant but unmistakable. Mr. Abernathy's spread was in that direction, a family with 4 small children. Elara's hand went to the worn stock of the Winchester that leaned against the wall. She barred the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She peered through the small greased paper window, her knuckles white. She saw nothing but the vast, indifferent landscape. The sounds faded, replaced once more by the predatory silence. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. She prayed for the Abernathys, a lump of ice forming in her stomach. She knew she couldn't go and check. To leave the relative safety of her cabin would be suicide. It was in the deep twilight, when the shadows had grown long and distorted, that she heard it. A scraping, dragging sound just outside the cabin door. Not the confident stride of a man, nor the furtive steps of a coyote. It was the sound of something broken. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice a reedy tremor. The Winchester was in her hands now, its cold weight a terrifying comfort. The only answer was a pained groan, a sound that was universally human in its agony. She waited, her breath held tight in her chest. The scraping continued closer now, followed by a heavy slump against the door itself. Silence. Was it a trap? a trick to lure her out. The stories they told in Tucson were filled with such warnings. Tales of Apache cunning, of brutal raids and unspeakable horrors. But the groan she had heard, it was not the sound of a predator. It was the sound of a dying animal. Against every instinct, against every warning Jedediah had ever given her, a different feeling began to surface, a deeply ingrained, almost forgotten flicker of compassion. She had been a healer's daughter back in Ohio, taught to mend broken things. Slowly, cautiously, she crept to the door and slid the heavy bar aside. She cracked it open just an inch, the rifle aimed at the sliver of darkness. On her doorstep, half collapsed in a pool of his own blood, was a man, an Apache. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, his features sharp and proud, even in his current state. A feathered talisman was tied into his long black hair. A deep gash in his side, just below the ribs, oozed blood, staining the hard-packed earth, a terrifying black in the dim light. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. In one hand, he still clutched a knife, but the grip was slack. Fear and hatred warred with a pity so profound, it made her ache. This man, or men like him, were the reason she was a widow. They were the faceless terror that haunted her nights. To the world he was a savage, a murderer. But here on her doorstep, he was just a man bleeding to death. To leave him would be to let him die. To bring him in, what would that mean? Her gaze fell on the crude cross marking Jedediah's grave. What would he have done? He was a hard man, but a just one. Do unto others the Bible taught. Was that meant to include one's enemies? The man moaned again, a soft guttural sound, and his eyes fluttered open. For a heartbeat, they locked with hers. There was no hatred in them, no malice, only a vast, bottomless well of pain. In that instant, Aara Hayes made her decision. With a strength born of desperation and a sliver of her old self, she unlatched the door, laid the rifle aside, and grabbing the man under his arms began to drag her enemy into her home. The door swung shut behind them, sealing them inside, two worlds colliding in a small, lonely cabin under the vast, uncaring sky. The first 48 hours were a waking nightmare, a blur of blood-hot water and feverish whispers in a language she did not understand. She managed to haul the Apache onto her own bed. The irony was a bitter pill she swallowed without flinching. His body was lean and corded with muscle, surprisingly heavy. She cut away the blood-stiffened buckskin shirt, her hands hesitating for only a moment at the intimate contact. The wound was ugly, a deep slice from a Bowie knife, by the look of it, jagged and inflamed. It was a miracle he'd made it this far. Drawing on the long-dormant knowledge from her childhood, she cleaned it as best she could with boiled water and whiskey, the raw spirit, making him cry out and arch his back in a silent scream of agony. She tore strips from one of her own clean petticoats for bandages, the fine linen a stark white against his copper skin. He drifted in and out of consciousness. In his delirium, he spoke. The words were harsh and guttural names and places that meant nothing to her. Sometimes he would lash out his hands, grabbing for a weapon that wasn't there. During these moments, Aara would retreat to the far side of the cabin the Winchester held at the ready, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was his nurse, but she was also his jailer, and she never forgot it for a second. She learned the contours of his face in the flickering lamplight, a strong jaw, a proud aquiline nose, and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanently severe expression. She saw the intricate patterns of the beadwork on his moccasins, the symbols she couldn't decipher. He was a person, a man with a history, etched onto his very being. This thought was both terrifying and deeply humanizing. On the third day, the fever broke. She woke to find him watching her, his eyes clear and intelligent for the first time. The pain was still there, but it was overshadowed by a cold, hard appraisal. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of pride and hostility. He was no longer just a patient. He was an Apache warrior, awake and aware in the home of a white woman. He tried to sit up, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips. She moved to help him, but he flinched away from her touch as if burned, his eyes flashing with contempt. Water, he rasped the single English word, startling her. She brought it to him in a tin cup. He drank greedily, his eyes never leaving hers, watching her every move. The air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken questions and primal distrust. He was her prisoner, but she felt just as trapped. He was a coiled rattlesnake, temporarily wounded, but no less deadly. Days bled into a week. A tense, silent routine developed. She would cook her meager meals of corn mush and salted pork, leaving a portion for him on a stool by the bed. He would eat only when she had her back turned. She would clean and redress his wound, an ordeal they both endured with clenched jaws. He never spoke another word of English, reverting to his own tongue in short, clipped phrases if he needed something, pointing with his chin. She learned his name by accident. In a fever dream, he had cried it out over and over. Taza. Taza. The name felt strange on her tongue when she thought it. It had a sound of power of the wilderness itself. One afternoon, seeking a moment's respite from the suffocating tension, she sat on the porch cleaning Jedediah's pistol. Taza watched her from the bed through the open door, his expression unreadable. She worked with a practiced efficiency that Jedediah had taught her, breaking the weapon down, oiling the parts, reassembling it with a series of satisfying clicks. When she was done, she loaded it and placed it on the small table next to her chair. It was a clear, unspoken message. I saved you, but I am not helpless. For the first time since he'd woken, he initiated a conversation of sorts. He spoke in Apache, his voice low and steady. She, of course, did not understand the words, but the tone was not one of gratitude. It was questioning, demanding. She just shook her head. I don't understand you. He pointed at himself. Taza. Then he pointed to the mountains, the east, then gestured in a wide circle. Under the people. He was telling her who he was. Then he pointed at her, his expression hardening. He made a gesture of a rifle firing, then pointed at the ground at his own wound. He looked at her, his eyes boring into hers. Why? The question hung between them more potent than any spoken word. Why save an enemy? Ilara's own turmoil rose to the surface. Why had she? Looking at this proud, defiant man who clearly despised her, she didn't have an answer. Because you were dying, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the Christian thing to do. He did not understand her words, but he seemed to grasp the sentiment. A sneer touched his lips. He saw her piety not as a virtue, but as a weakness, a foolish sentimentality that had no place in the world he knew. He spoke again, a short, sharp sentence, and this time the meaning was unmistakable. He pointed at the door, then at himself. He wanted to leave. His debt in his mind was paid by his survival. He owed her nothing. Her fear, which had receded into a low hum, spiked again. He was still weak, but getting stronger every day. Soon, he would be able to overpower her. She had saved his life, and in return, he offered her nothing but contempt. She was a fool, a lonely, terrified fool who had brought a wolf into her home and nursed it back to health. The rifle, she decided, would not leave her side again. The silence in the cabin returned heavier and more dangerous than before. It was no longer the silence of two strangers, but the silence of two enemies waiting for the other to make a move. Another week crawled by. Taza's strength returned with a speed that both amazed and terrified her. He was soon able to stand to walk the short length of the cabin, his gait still stiff but improving daily. The power dynamic was shifting palpably. He was no longer confined to the bed, a helpless patient. Now he was a pacing predator in a cage that was growing smaller by the hour. He would stand by the window for long periods, staring out at the landscape with an intensity that unsettled her. He was memorizing it, she realized, planning his departure. He paid her little mind, treating her as part of the furniture, a necessary inconvenience. Yet she felt his eyes on her whenever she moved, a constant, unnerving surveillance. The first twist in their grim story came not from within the cabin, but from the outside world. It arrived in the form of 3 riders, their horses kicking up a plume of dust that was visible for miles. Aara saw them coming long before they arrived, a knot of dread tightening in her gut. These weren't soldiers. Their clothes were a motley collection of buckskin and worn denim, and they rode with the lazy, arrogant slump of men who were a law unto themselves. "Get back in the bed," she hissed at Taza, her voice sharp with panic. "Cover yourself. Don't make a sound." For once, he seemed to understand the urgency in her tone. He saw the riders too, and a look of grim recognition crossed his face. He obeyed without argument, pulling the quilt up to his chin, his hand instinctively going to the place where his knife should have been. Aara took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and stepped onto the porch, the Winchester held loosely in her hands, its barrel pointed at the ground. It was a posture of defense, not aggression. The lead rider was a gaunt man with a stringy, tobacco-stained beard and pale, merciless eyes. He reined in his horse a few yards from her, spitting a brown stream of juice into the dust. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Name's Silas Kain. Me and my boys are on the hunt." Aara's blood ran cold. She had heard the name. Silas Kain and his men weren't bounty hunters. They were exterminators. They claimed to be tracking renegade Apache, but their reputation was for indiscriminate slaughter, collecting government bounties on any scalp they could take, man, woman, or child. "What do you want?" Aara asked, keeping her voice steady. "We're tracking a small war party. Hit the Abernathy place a couple of weeks back. Found what was left of 'em yesterday." His lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Found a blood trail, too. One of the Red Devils was gut-shot, but he got away. Trail led this direction." His pale eyes roamed over her, her cabin lingering on the closed door. "You been all alone out here, ma'am? Ain't seen nothing unusual." "I've seen nothing," Aara said, the lie tasting like acid. "I've been right here. My husband passed. I keep to myself." Kain's gaze was penetrating. He didn't believe her. Or rather, he didn't care if she was telling the truth. He was sniffing the air like a wolf sensing weakness. A lone woman. It's a dangerous place for that. Mighty dangerous. You sure you ain't had no visitors? No one asking for help. He dismounted his spurs, jingling a death knell in the quiet air. The other two men fanned out their rifles, held at the ready. I'm sure Aara said, her grip tightening on the Winchester. You're trespassing. I'll ask you to be on your way. Kain chuckled a dry, rattling sound. Feisty. I like that. He took a step closer. We'd like to take a look inside, just to be sure. Can't be too careful. No, Aara said, raising the rifle just a few inches. It was a bluff, and they all knew it. She couldn't possibly fight all three of them. From inside the cabin, a floorboard creaked. It was an infinitesimal sound, but in the tense silence, it was like a thunderclap. Kain's head snapped towards the door, his eyes narrowing. What was that? The wind, Aara said. Quickly. The house is old. It settles. He wasn't buying it. A predatory grin spread across his face. He had her. He knew she was lying. Well, now he drawled, taking another step. I think we'll just invite ourselves in for a glass of water. Suddenly, Taza's voice cut through the air from inside the cabin. He shouted something in Apache, a sharp, powerful challenge. It was the cry of a warrior, not a wounded man. Kain and his men froze, their surprise evident. Kain's grin vanished, replaced by a look of vindictive triumph. Well, well, well. What do we have here? A little lamb hiding a wolf. He looked back at Aara, his eyes full of contempt. You're a traitor to your own kind, ma'am. Hiding one of the savages that butchered your neighbors. He raised his own rifle, aiming it squarely at her chest. Now you're gonna step aside. We're coming in, and we ain't leaving no witnesses. The world seemed to slow down. Aara stood frozen, caught between the murderous hatred of Silas Kain and the unknown fury of the man in her cabin. Her act of mercy had brought her to this. She was going to die right here on her own porch, killed by the very people she was supposed to consider her protectors, all because of the enemy she had sheltered. The standoff was broken by a sudden, violent crash. The greased paper window of the cabin exploded outwards as a stool thrown with incredible force flew through it. The diversion was perfect. As Kain and his men flinched their attention, momentarily diverted, Taza erupted from the cabin door. He was not the weak, bed-ridden man they expected. He moved with a fluid, deadly grace, a length of firewood clutched in his hand like a war club. He didn't charge Kain directly, but launched himself at the man on the right, swinging the makeshift weapon with a guttural roar. There was a sickening crunch of bone as the firewood connected with the man's jaw, sending him sprawling into the dust unconscious. Aara, jolted from her paralysis, reacted on pure instinct. She swung the barrel of the Winchester, not to shoot, but to strike. She slammed the heavy steel barrel into Silas Kain's outstretched arms, knocking his rifle aside. The gun fired the bullet, whining harmlessly into the sky. The third man, recovering his wits, leveled his rifle at Taza. Before he could fire, Taza had closed the distance, his movements a blur. He dropped the club, seized the rifle barrel, and used the man's own momentum to twist him off balance. A swift, brutal kick to the knee sent the man down with a cry of pain. Silas Kain snarled, fumbling for the pistol at his hip, but Taza was already on him. He slammed Kain back against the cabin wall, his forearm pressed hard against Kain's throat. Taza's face was a mask of cold fury. his eyes burning with a lethal intensity. He disarmed Kain with terrifying ease, tossing the pistol away. He held the man pinned, choking his face, turning a mottled purple. Aara stood breathing heavily, the scene unfolding before her in a dizzying rush. Taza could kill him, right here, right now. He could snap his neck, and perhaps he should. Kain was a monster, but Taza didn't. He held him for a long, terrifying moment, letting Kain feel the edge of his own mortality. Then, with a grunt of disgust, he shoved him away. Kain stumbled and fell gasping for air. "Go!" Taza rasped the single word, a raw command. He gestured with his chin towards their horses. "Take them. Go!" Kain stared at Taza, then at Aara, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and pure, undiluted hatred. He scrambled to his feet, helped his groaning, injured companions onto their horses, and without another word galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and a promise of vengeance that hung in the air like poison. Silence descended once more, but this time it was different. It was the silence of a shared battle, a shared survival. Aara looked at Taza, who was leaning against the cabin wall, his chest heaving. The exertion had reopened his wound. A fresh patch of red was seeping through the bandages. They were no longer just a captor and a prisoner. They were allies, bound by the blood of a common enemy. He pushed himself off the wall and limped back inside. Aara followed her mind, reeling. He sat heavily on the bed, his head in his hands. He had saved her life. This man, this Apache raider, had just saved her from Silas Kain. She fetched the water and fresh bandages, her movements automatic. As she tended to his wound, her hands were gentle. This time he did not flinch from her touch. Their roles had been irrevocably reversed, and then tangled into something new entirely. When she was finished, he looked up at her. His face was grim. "They will come back," he said, his English slow, deliberate. He had been concealing how much he knew. "More men. Soldiers, maybe. They will say you help Apache. They will hang you." The truth of his words hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was a marked woman, an outcast, a traitor. Kain would spread the story painting her as a willing accomplice to a savage. No one would believe her version of events. There was no place for her in the white world anymore. "What do we do?" she asked, the we slipping out naturally. Taza stood and walked to the door, staring out at the approaching dusk. "We leave now." He looked back at her, his expression unyielding stone. "You cannot travel alone. They will find you. I cannot travel with a white woman. They will kill me and do worse to you." He faced her fully, his dark eyes holding hers, stripping away all pretense. He was not asking. He was stating a fact, a term of survival in a world that had no room for them. "In my tribe," he began, his voice low and devoid of any emotion, "when a warrior takes a woman, she is his. She is protected by his name, by his kin. She becomes one of the Nenda." Aara stared at him, a cold dread creeping up her spine as she began to understand. This was not a proposal. It was a sentence. "I will take you as my wife," Taza stated. "It is the only way. To my people, you will be Taza's woman. They will not harm you. To the white men, if they find us, it may not matter. But it is the only path. You will come with me now, as my wife." Horror washed over her, swift and suffocating. It was an impossible choice. Be hanged as a traitor by her own people, or become the property, the possession of an Apache warrior. She had saved his life, and her reward was a new kind of bondage. This wasn't a marriage. It was an ultimatum, a claim of ownership born from violence and necessity. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I can't. I won't." Taza took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. His face was hard, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with an intensity that left no room for argument. "Silas Kain will be back by sunrise," he said. "He will not be alone. Your Christian God cannot save you from them. I can." He reached out, not to touch her, but to point towards the mountains, a dark, jagged line against the dying light. "Your world is gone. My world is all that is left for you. Wife or corpse. You will choose now." Elaara's world had been reduced to the space between two impossible choices. The face of Silas Kain, twisted with righteous malice, swam in her mind. She pictured his men, their casual cruelty, and the finality of a rope. Then she looked at Taza. He was a stranger, an enemy by birth, and yet he had just fought for her. His ultimatum was brutal, a stripping away of her identity, but it was also a promise of life. The fight went out of her, replaced by a hollow resignation. There was no real choice to be made. "I will go with you," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Taza gave a single, sharp nod. There was no triumph in his eyes, only grim purpose. "Take what is useful," he commanded. "Blanket, water skin, the small gun." He gestured to Jedediah's pistol. "Leave the rest. We move fast." Their preparations were stark and swift. Aara wrapped a spare wool blanket the pistol and a small sack of dried corn in her shawl. She looked around the cabin one last time. It was the only home she had ever known as a married woman, a sanctuary built of love and hope. Now it was a tomb of a life that no longer existed. With a trembling hand, she touched the rough wood of the door frame, a silent goodbye to Jedediah, to the woman she had been. Then she turned her back on it forever and stepped out into the night. There was no ceremony to mark their new monstrous union. As they stood in the moonlight, Taza reached into a small pouch at his waist and pulled out a simple bracelet made of woven horsehair and a single polished piece of turquoise. He took her wrist, his grip firm and impersonal, and tied it on. "Now you are Taza's woman," he said. It was not a vow. It was a branding. Their journey began. Taza set a relentless pace, heading not for the established trails, but deep into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of the Dragoon Mountains. The landscape that had been the backdrop to her life now became an obstacle, an enemy. Taza moved through it with an innate animal grace, his feet seeming to find purchase on the loose sri and rocky outcrops as if by instinct. For Aara it was hell. Her simple leather shoes were shredded within hours. The thorny grasp of cat-claw acacia tore at her dress and her skin. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her lungs burned. Taza showed no sympathy. When she stumbled, he would pull her to her feet with an impatient tug. When she cried out in pain, he would silence her with a harsh look. Weakness was a luxury they could not afford. Yet through his harshness, she began to see a different kind of care. He was teaching her. He showed her how to walk silently, placing her feet from heel to toe. He pointed out which plants were edible and which were poison. He taught her to read the signs of the land where to find water, how to know when a storm was coming. He was stripping away her old self and forging a new one, a creature that could survive in his world. The nights were the hardest. They slept without a fire, huddled together for warmth against the biting chill of the high desert. The forced intimacy was a torment for Aara. She would lie rigid, every muscle tensed, acutely aware of his presence, beside her the steady rhythm of his breathing, the scent of dust and leather and man. He never touched her beyond the necessities of their travel, yet his proximity was a constant, overwhelming reality. Slowly, tentatively, they began to talk. The conversations were practical, born of necessity, fragments of language exchanged in the darkness. She learned Apache words for water to fear, ko dangjerba. He in turn began to string together more English words, his pronunciation clipped and guttural. One night, huddled beneath a rock overhang, as a cold rain fell, he asked about the small wooden cross she wore around her neck, a gift from her mother. She explained the concept of her god of faith, of a life after this one. He listened without comment, his expression unreadable in the gloom. Then he spoke of his own world. He told her of Usen, the giver of life. He spoke of the mountain spirits, the Gunnorn, who held great power. His world was alive, filled with forces and spirits she could not see. He told her of his first wife, Sonsi Aara. The name meant morning star. He spoke of her smile, of the sun she had given him, a boy with laughing eyes. He did not speak of how they died, but Aara saw it in the sudden tension in his jaw, the bleak emptiness that filled his eyes. They had been killed by soldiers. In that shared darkness, their separate griefs touched, creating a fragile, unspoken bridge of understanding. She was a widow. He was a widower. They were both ghosts haunted by the past. Their journey was interrupted by the second devastating twist. They were moving through a narrow canyon when they heard the unmistakable sound of shod horses approaching. An army patrol. Down Taza hissed, pulling her behind a cluster of boulders. A small detachment of blue-coated cavalrymen rode into view, their faces weary and sun-beaten. They were close, too close. One of the soldiers' horses shied, sensing their presence. Taza knew they had only seconds. He looked at Aara, a swift, decisive plan forming in his eyes. He squeezed her arm, a silent command to stay put. Then he broke cover. He let out a loud war cry and sprinted in the opposite direction, a fleeting brown shape against the grey rock. "There he is! It's one of them," a sergeant yelled. The soldiers, their training taking over, spurred their horses in pursuit of the decoy. It was a selfless, suicidal act designed to draw them away from her. But as the patrol thundered past her hiding place, one of the younger troopers glanced back. His eyes widened as he saw her, a white woman, her clothes torn, her face scratched and bruised, cowering behind a rock. His mind leaped to the only conclusion it could. "Captain!" he shouted, reining in his horse. "Over here! She's got a woman!" The entire patrol screeched to a halt. Taza, seeing what had happened from a distance, froze for a fatal second. He had saved her only to deliver her into a different kind of trap. The soldiers surrounded Aara, their rifles pointed not at her, but at the rocks where Taza had disappeared. To them the scene was simple and unambiguous. They saw a terrified white woman, clearly a captive, who had just been rescued from a savage Apache kidnapper. "It's all right, Mom," the captain said, his voice soft and reassuring as he dismounted. "You're safe now. We'll get you back to Fort Grant. You're safe." Aara looked from his kind, earnest face to the empty rocks where Taza had been. Safe. She had never felt more in danger in her entire life. They saw her as a victim, a prize to be reclaimed. They didn't see the bracelet on her wrist, They didn't understand the journey she had just made, the knowledge she had gained, the bond that had been forged in fire and fear. She tried to protest. "No, you don't understand, he—" "Hush now," the captain said, patting her shoulder with patronizing sympathy. "Don't you worry. You've been through a terrible ordeal. We'll take care of you." They put her on a horse and turned back towards the fort, leaving a few men behind to hunt for the renegade. Aara looked back, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She was being rescued from the one man who had kept her alive and delivered into a world that had already condemned her. Fort Grant was a dusty, sun-bleached outpost of civilization, carved into the hostile landscape. To the soldiers, it was a bastion of order. To Aara, it felt like a prison with higher walls than her cabin. She was immediately placed under the care of the fort's commander, Major Harrison, a man with a neatly trimmed moustache and eyes that saw the world in rigid lines of black and white, civilized and savage. She was treated with a suffocating kindness that grated on her nerves. The other officers' wives brought her clean clothes, hot broth, and sympathetic platitudes. They saw her as a tragic figure, a poor widow who had endured the ultimate horror of being captured by an Apache. They clucked their tongues at her torn dress and bruised skin, imagining unspeakable violations. They wanted her story a lurid tale of terror that would confirm all their prejudices. "You are a very brave woman, Mrs. Hayes," Major Harrison told her in his office, his voice laced with paternal authority. "We have sent patrols to hunt down the savage who took you. Your testimony will be invaluable in ensuring he is brought to justice. We need you to describe him, his war party, their location." Aara sat numbly, the borrowed calico dress feeling like a costume. This was her chance, her way out. She could give them Taza's name. She could describe the route they had taken. She could be Aara Hayes again, the respectable widow. She could be free, safe. But the words wouldn't come. Safety, she was beginning to realize, was an illusion. Was there safety in the world of Silas Kain, who would have killed her without a second thought? Was there safety in this fort, where men like Major Harrison looked at her with pity but didn't truly see her? They saw a symbol, a victim. They didn't see the woman who had learned to find water in the desert, who had stood side by side with a warrior and fought off murderers. They didn't know about the shared grief for a lost child, a whispered name in the dark. Her captivity with Taza had been a fight for survival. This new freedom felt like a slow death of the spirit. Meanwhile, in the mountains, Taza was living his own nightmare. He had seen the soldiers take Aara. To his warrior's mind, there was only one interpretation: she had gone with them willingly. She had chosen her own kind. She had used him to survive and then abandoned him at the first opportunity. The act felt like the deepest betrayal, a knife to the gut, far more painful than the one that had first laid him at her door. He made his way back to his people's hidden stronghold, a rancheria nestled deep in the Chiricahua Mountains. His uncle, the renowned war chief Victorio, listened to his story with a grim face. Victorio was a pragmatic and feared leader, a contemporary of the great Geronimo, and he saw the situation in terms of honor and strategy. "This white woman has brought shame to you, my nephew Victorio," declared his voice echoing among the assembled warriors. She saw the blue coats and ran to them. "She has betrayed the one who claimed her, the one who fought for her. She will tell them where we are. She will lead them to our families." The other warriors murmured in agreement. The code was clear. A betrayal like this could not be ignored. It demanded a response, swift and bloody. "We will raid the fort," Victorio announced. "We will wash away this dishonor with the blood of the soldiers. We will show them the price of taking what belongs to the Ende." Back at Fort Grant, Elara's turmoil grew. A friendly young lieutenant trying to comfort her let slip the news. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Hayes. We're on high alert. We have intelligence that Victorio's band is on the warpath, probably because of what happened to you. But they won't get near this fort." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. A raid, a bloodbath, all because of her. She pictured the soldiers, many of them just boys, dying. She pictured Taza, his face contorted in a mask of rage and grief, fighting a battle he couldn't win. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that he would be at the forefront of that attack, seeking either vengeance or death. In that moment, everything became clear. Her choice was not between the Apache world and the white world, because she no longer truly belonged to either. Her choice was between war and peace, between vengeance and a desperate, fragile hope. Her choice was Taza. That night, she made her move. She had been observing, learning the fort's routines with the same intensity she had learned to read the wilderness. She shed the calico dress and put back on her own tattered, travel-stained clothes, the clothes of Taza's woman. She took the pistol she had kept hidden and a small amount of food. Using the skills Taza had taught her, she slipped past a distracted sentry, scaled a low section of the adobe wall at the rear of the fort, and melted into the darkness. She ran, her heart pounding, guided by the stars and a desperate instinct. She had to find them before they reached the fort. She had to intercept the war party. It was an act of madness. A lone woman on foot, seeking out a band of Apache warriors bent on revenge. They would likely kill her before she could speak a single word. She found them 2 days later at a place called Bitter Creek, a small stream that snaked through a rocky canyon. They were preparing, painting their faces and their horses for battle. She saw Victorio, his presence, commanding. And she saw Taza standing apart from the others, his face a grim canvas of loss and fury. Taking a deep breath that felt like it might be her last, she stepped out from behind the rocks and into the open. A wave of shock rippled through the warriors. Rifles were raised, bows were drawn. They saw a ghost, an apparition. She walked forward, her hands held open and empty. Her eyes locked on Taza. She stopped 20 paces from him, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Taza," she called out, her voice clear and steady in the tense silence. He stared at her, his face a mixture of disbelief, rage, and a flicker of something more profound. She reached up and touched the horsehair and turquoise bracelet on her wrist, the one he had given her. "Ni Taza bi'ad nshwi." She said the Apache words she had practiced over and over in her mind, coming out haltingly. "I am Taza's wife." She looked from Taza to the stern, unforgiving face of Victorio. "I did not betray him," she said, her voice ringing with passion and truth. "The soldiers took me. I did not choose them. I choose now." She took another step forward, her gaze returning to the man she had crossed a world to find. "I choose my husband." The canyon held its breath. Aara stood her ground, a lone woman of one world claiming her place in another. Her life hung on the precipice of Taza's decision. He could turn away, condemning her to death and himself to a path of endless war. Or he could step forward and choose a new path, one they would have to forge together in the heart of the storm. The silence in the canyon was absolute, broken only by the soft murmur of Bitter Creek. Every warrior's gaze was fixed on Taza, waiting. He stood like a man carved from the red rock of the canyon itself, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Betrayal had hardened his heart, but the sight of Aara, her courage, her defiance, the Apache words on her lips was a force of nature he had not anticipated. He saw not the weak white woman he thought had abandoned him, but a warrior in her own right, one who had risked everything to return to his side. Slowly, deliberately, Taza lowered the rifle he had been holding. He took a step forward, then another, until he stood directly in front of her. He looked into her eyes, searching for the truth, and found it there, shining and unbreakable. He saw the woman who had dragged him from death's door, the woman who had faced down Silas Kain, the woman who had walked through the wilderness and now stood before a war party to claim him. He reached out, and his fingers brushed the turquoise bracelet on her wrist. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. He turned to face his uncle. Victorio Taza, said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. She speaks the truth. Her heart is not white. It is Inde. My honor is not lost. It has been returned. He looked at the assembled warriors, men he had known his entire life. To attack the fort now is not for my honor. It is for a vengeance that will only bring more soldiers, more death to our families. This woman has shown us another path, the path of a family that stands together against all enemies, not just the ones with white skin. Victorio, a man whose life had been a long and bloody war against the white invaders, studied Aara with his sharp, intelligent eyes. He saw no fear in her only resolve. He saw the way his nephew stood beside her, no longer a shamed warrior, but a man who had found something more valuable than revenge, a loyalty that transcended blood and race. The raid was a matter of pride, but pride was a cold comfort for a people on the brink of extinction. Survival was what mattered. With a slow, deliberate movement, Victorio raised his hand and wiped a streak of black war paint from his cheek. It was a simple gesture, but its meaning was profound. The raid was over. The resolution was not clean or easy. It was a messy, complicated piece. As Taza and Aara journeyed back with the Apaches, she was an object of intense curiosity and suspicion. Some particularly, the women looked at her with open hostility, seeing her as an outsider, a symbol of the people who had brought them so much pain. Others, seeing Victorio's acceptance and Taza's fierce protection, offered hesitant gestures of inclusion. They did not return to the white world. That path was closed to her forever. She was no longer Aara Hayes, the settler's widow. She was now known only as Taza's woman, a name that was both a shield and a cage. Nor could they live in the heart of the rancheria. Taza knew their presence would be a constant source of tension, a reminder of the raid that never was. With Victorio's blessing, they made a new home for themselves in a secluded valley, a place of stark beauty nestled between the mountains far from the soldiers' patrols and the main Apache camps. Their life was one of hardship, a daily struggle for existence. They built a wickiup, a simple shelter of brush and hide. Taza taught her the ways of his people in earnest now, how to track game, how to find medicinal plants, how to tan hides and speak the language of the Ende. In turn, she taught him more English, read to him from the single Bible she had salvaged from her old life, and showed him a gentleness he had long forgotten. The forced marriage born of a brutal ultimatum began its slow, miraculous transformation into a genuine partnership. The silence between them was no longer one of tension, but of comfortable companionship. They learned the landscape of each other's scars, the silent language of shared glances and knowing smiles. They had been two solitary ghosts, haunted by their pasts. But in their shared isolation, they found a strange and powerful solace. They had become each other's tribe, a nation of two. Their love was not the easy, laughing love of her life with Jedediah. It was a quieter, more profound thing, forged in violence, tempered by loss, and sealed by a choice made at the edge of a blade. It was the love of survivors, a hard-won peace in a world that had tried its best to tear them apart. Their life was not one of happily ever after. It was a life on the edge, a constant dance of survival between two worlds that would never fully accept them. But as Aara would watch Taza returning from a hunt, his silhouette dark against the setting sun, she felt not fear, but a deep, abiding sense of belonging. She had lost everything, only to find a home in the most unexpected of places in the heart of the man who was once her enemy. They were outcasts, yes, but they were outcasts together, and in the untamed heart of the Wild West, that was the only kind of peace that mattered. Aara and Taza's story is a testament to the raw, untamed heart of the American West, a place where the lines between enemy and ally, captive and savior, could blur in the dust of a single sunset. Theirs was a journey not just across a harsh and unforgiving landscape, but through the even more treacherous territory of the human heart. They remind us that survival sometimes demands impossible choices, and that love can bloom in the most barren of soil, forged not in comfort, but in courage and a shared will to live. What would you have done in Aara's place? Could you have found the strength to make such a choice? If you were captivated by this tale of love and survival on the frontier, show your support by hitting that like button, share this video with a friend who loves epic drama, and be sure to subscribe for more true life stories from the pages of history. Let us know in the comments below which part of Aara and Taza's incredible journey moved you the most. We'll see you next time.